Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Boland, the chair of the Cannabis Practice Group at Hold On Law Partners, and this is the Above the Haze podcast. Today, my esteemed guest is Aaron Miles, the Chief Investment Officer at Verano. Aaron, thank you for joining the Above the Haze.
Jim, always great to connect. I'm happy to be here today.
I appreciate that. Aaron, could you give our viewers a little bit of your background and sort of how you got into cannabis?
My background has always been focused on capital markets. So even before cannabis, I focused on investor relations. So really managing the public aspect of a company, where you'd manage through investor relationships. I would get pulled into mergers and acquisitions, anything, as I say, capital markets from a treasury perspective. And really, general strategy as well. And how that was, I was able to translate that into the cannabis space where I received a random text message on a fateful night. And I was actually in Italy traveling with my wife, and I got a random text message saying, "Hey, would you ever consider helping take a cannabis company public?" I slammed my phone down. I said, "Absolutely not. I'm corporate through and through." And needless to say, I did my research on the space, looked at the growth opportunities, really saw what I would be able to, kind of put my stamp on a company instead of kind of doing a rinse and repeat and just like what we did in the past. So I started out at Cresco Labs. I know you're very familiar, and helped take the company public. And again, you're basically building, the public stature of a company from the ground up. So I went from Cresco. I had a brief tenure at the New York Stock Exchange, and then ended up getting back into cannabis at Cresco, and then transitioning over to Verano Holdings, which is where I'm currently at right now.
Excellent. What would you say is the biggest difference in taking a cannabis company public versus a non-cannabis company?
It's access to vendors and access to basically all available routes. When I first started at Cresco, the CFO at the time came in my office, and he was like, "Well, who's going to be our transfer agent?" And I'm like, "Well, it's going to be Computer Share. That's the transfer agent for everybody." And I called Computer Share, and they were like, "Absolutely not." And so then you're left in scramble mode. And so the tough part with cannabis is, there's some people who are going to accept you and as a publicly traded company, but most people can't work with you, and that's transitioning and that's changing. So I would say, when you're taking a company public and it's federally illegal in the U.S. but accepted in Canada, you really have to balance, your expectations. And so, we've been able to really evolve. And I think, we'll obviously get into some of the aspects of what U.S. capital markets can look like. But for us, it was like the blinking cursor on a computer when you're like starting, new folder, going public, and you're literally trying to figure out what to do. And so for us, those 2018 days looked a lot different than when we went public at Verano in 2021. More vendors were available. You had a more defined path, but it was the Wild West back then. So it's just access to vendors, and I was putting my skill set to use, but it was kind of useless at times because all my relationships, I couldn't utilize any of those. And so that's, I think, the biggest opportunity is just being a normal company going forward. Fingers crossed, right?
Yeah, exactly. On that note, there is a lot of movement, or hopefully movement happening in the space, including rescheduling. What do you think is the biggest potential impact of marijuana being moved to a Schedule 3 narcotic?
Yeah, I would say this. I think we're going to look at it from a capital markets perspective for the majority of this conversation, but there is a need from a medicinal perspective for cannabis to get across the finish line. I mean, you look at PTSD, you look at veterans, you look at people with Parkinson's. I mean, this has, we're just scratching the surface for what this could do. So having the availability to go down the research and development route and really being able to utilize the power of this plant medicine, I think is probably the most important aspect. But really what a rescheduling would do for us is make us a legal company, right? Like a high likelihood of addiction, no medicinal benefits is total BS when you actually look that we're classified as the same level as heroin when fentanyl is actually a Schedule 2. And fentanyl, again, time and a place from a pain management perspective, but it's also being abused on the streets. And so for us, I think it's acceptance at the highest level of the federal government, being able to operate like a normal business. So now go back to my original comments about going public in the U.S. or in Canada. In the U.S., I mean, we're going to be able to use the largest banks. We're going to be able to use utilize the biggest exchanges. There's going to be credit cards. I mean, so like, federal banking, let's think about this. Like we have 100 plus state chartered bank accounts. So that's all takes bandwidth to manage through those. And there's covenants you have to, meet, and you have to adhere to all these rules and regulations. And so our job really isn't easy. We're a cash only business. And, if we could just operate like a normal business, I think that's what rescheduling starts the path of. Now, rescheduling on its own might not get you U.S. capital markets. We've all heard the Garland memo, kind of like the Cole memo version 2 with banking added in, which would be great. But at least rescheduling would show that we're being accepted at the highest level of the government. And so just be able to operate like a normal business is game changing for us.
Absolutely.
And let's mention 280E, right? I mean, that's, that actually, without any type of banking reform, we are now classified as a legal business. And so the 280E tax treatment now becomes a thing of the past. And we quantified that at about $80 million for us last year.
So I wanted to ask you about that because my understanding is nothing has changed from a legal perspective. However, a lot of the MSOs, and you just mentioned Verano, has basically started to reject 280E with their filings and reported, like you said, significant returns as of last year. What changed from the company's perspective and gave you that flexibility to essentially ignore the 280E provision?
Yeah, so we haven't done the actual filing yet. This is something that we've been evaluating for years. I think a couple years ago, it was more of kind of a pipe dream, pushing back, and you have to get auditors to sign off on it, and your tax, counsel to sign off on it as well. And if there's not a high likelihood, I think it was like 20-25%, then they wouldn't. And so, truly, power to them. I mean, they made the big first step. And they were able to get some real dollars back, and 113 million coming back to them is real. But it still is an uncertain tax position. I'm sure that there will be pushback from the federal government, but this is something that we're paying very, very close attention to. And again, if you think about it, the irony of the situation is you're nervous about anti-money laundering, right? So you're trying to limit our business operations, but then you're taxing us at a higher level, accepting our dollars, and then kind of giving yourself cover from any type of anti-money laundering concern. So, I mean, it's like, I'm careful in my words here, but it's very ironic that we are at that stage, right now. But what we've done is, we've always kind of leveraged, tax deferral, and where we were able to kind of defer taxes and basically build a balance at a much lower, basically cost of capital than we would if we were to go out and borrow against it. And now there's definitely some paths being defined where we can maybe push back and get some of those dollars back that we would have had to pay anyway. So I think the government's starting to realize that there is some medicinal components to this. You're starting to see a lot of opposition pop up, which in my mind, you see the Republicans come, pop up and start to push back on this, which is a good thing, because you're looking at, if it's starting to make progress in DC and you're starting to get the attention of the opposition, it means that it's actually starting to take root. And so 280E, I mean, I think I've seen it quantified at like $1 billion for I think the top 6 operators in the space. And it's sad that money comes into play here, because when I talked about the medicinal component, I mean, there's people who are literally suffering every day without access to this medicine. So it's going to be interesting here, and things seem to definitely be moving in the right direction.
So just sticking with the 280E thing for a minute, do you feel like, and it's like so many things in cannabis, right, where we live in this gray area and the regulations are ambiguous, and somebody, like you said, has to take that first step, right, and sort of see what happens on an enforcement level. And you said TrueLeaf, took that leap of faith and actually got a refund. Mm-hmm. Do you think that they felt like the political climate had reached a point where it was safe to do so? It sounded like you guys have been talking about this for quite some time. Just trying to figure out why now.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if you go from Schedule 1 to 3, right, now there's medicinal benefit and there's not a high likelihood of addiction. Well, why are we being taxed at the level that we're being taxed at? Because we're not considered to be a medicinal product. And so if the government's going to stamp it and say this has been a medicinal product all along, that's where that gray area really starts to come in focus. Because why are we going to say, okay, let's just say this fall 2024, the rescheduling takes place and takes root. why aren't we looking backwards? Because if you're basically admitting now that there is medicinal component to this product, and so looking back in arrears, we're not going to cover a tax bill of $80 million a year just because you now have decided that this is a medicinal component. So I think since we've gotten really close to the DEA rescheduling, I think Trulieve, and I can't speak for the company, obviously, but maybe saw a path there where they're like, this is going to be in conjunction with the government now coming out and saying there's a medicinal component to this. And then it would really be hard to push back on that claim, because if you look at it, if we're medicinal, you're taxing us because we're not medicinal. I mean, it's very simple math there.
What do you think that that rescheduling does in terms of investor willingness to participate in the market and companies' ability to raise capital?
Overall, just a rescheduling probably doesn't get you Fidelity and T. Rowe and Wellington, but it maybe starts the conversation with some of those firms, because they're not even really doing a lot of research, at least to my knowledge. There's some smaller institutions that I think just a rescheduling would give them comfortability to be able to start to invest, because their custodians are probably going to say, okay, the government now has accepted this at the highest level, banking's going to be on the heels of this. But I think it stirs up a lot of interest, and I think it's going to really start to pick up steam in the sense of what exchanges do, what institutions do. I mean, we've been having these conversations for 6 years, and there's been a lot of stops and starts. So I think people are going to want to see some very clear and defined paths here, that this is now accepted by the government. And so I think it's a good first step. I think it'll get some dollars into the space, but what it'll really do is kind of open the door for any type of banking reform that could come out. And so when you think about it, the exchanges, there's going to be work that is going to have to be done. I mean, there's how many companies that are listed up in Canada, and you start to think about IPO proceeds are down in the US. I mean, there's going to be banking fees, legal fees, that, are really being missed right now. So there's a lot of incentive to get this across the finish line. People just need to, there's zero risk when it comes to most exchanges. Like the New York Stock Exchange is not going to, take a chance on an outlying industry when there's no defined protections from the government. But I would also say I would be very surprised if there wasn't some type of banking element written into this, right? Because this is all about job creation. This is all about beefing up the economy, and to not put banking as part of that, which could potentially limit credit cards. It's a great first step, but you're just eliminating 280E, which is now going to take tax dollars away from the government and basically not allowing the industry to really explode the way that it can. I think there's that incentive for tax revenue and money coming back into the U.S. from a capital markets perspective. But again, this year we've been let down many, many, many times. So we definitely temper our expectations, but it definitely feels different this time around. So,
well, it's funny. I always tell people, I teach a class on cannabis law, and when I'm getting the syllabus ready, I look at the syllabus from the previous semester, going back a couple semesters, and there's all these topics that I look at and I'm like, yep, that didn't pan out. That didn't pan out. Or we're still chasing it, right? And one of those things is banking reform. And now we have the Safer Banking Act because Congress doesn't lack originality. What is your take on the Safer Banking Act and the possibility of that being passed and what that might look like for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could come in. I think banking can come in two ways, right? I think it could come in the form of the Garland memo with some banking protections written in there. I also think Safer at this point could potentially move across the finish line as well, because Congress has a lot of incentive to get that across the finish line. I mean, these politicians have been using this for 6 years as kind of like the pawn in the game. And, we want to help the small players. And we've met with a lot of very predominant high level, senators, right, who were like, listen, the longer this takes to pass, the stronger you're actually making us. I mean, we produced $73 million of free cash flow in 2023, right? And $938 million of revenue. You look at some of these smaller players that are literally just trying to keep the lights on. So you think about what banking can do. And so I think early on, the misconception is that we don't want to give the big MSOs the advantage from a banking perspective. So I think they were trying to figure out how they could tailor it. Like, could they put some type of fee on going public, because we're going to try to feed that back into the community. Well, now fast forward 6 years, a lot of companies have gone under. and the bigger companies who have really built for no regulatory moves are really thriving in this space. So I think there's a lot of incentive to get banking across the finish line. I think once 280E gets eliminated, which safe banking would have done potentially back in the day, I think that you're looking at, there's a lot of incentive to get banking across the finish line. So I think it's most likely not going to be in line where DEA and all this stuff happens on the same day. But I think everybody's waiting to see what the DEA does. You're hearing in the near term that, it could potentially get the stamp of approval. I think once that happens, you'll start to see the memo come out. You'll start to see safe banking or safer banking really start to pick up some steam, because there's a lot of incentive to have that in conjunction. Because, as I said, it doesn't really make sense to go to Schedule 3 and then say, okay, we're just going to stop here, right? Like, what does that do for the space? It doesn't, and it doesn't do much in the sense without banking it, to really to allow the industry to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my next question has to do with, what do you think is the impact of rescheduling in terms of the overall industry and consolidation? One of the things that I've always been concerned about in rescheduling rather than legalizing outright doesn't do anything to alleviate my concerns is the larger industries, so alcohol, tobacco, big pharma, coming in and taking over. And now, to your point earlier, I think we've reached a point, especially companies like Verano, where the industry is too big to be swallowed completely, right, by another industry.
Yeah.
Personally, I fear big pharma coming in because, sort of to your point earlier, I got into cannabis for the medicinal aspect of it, right? And I believe in it as a medicine. I also believe in it as an alternative to opioids. And I have a real concern about pharma coming in and then benefiting from cannabis, which has been used as an alternative. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on where you see the industry sort of as a whole going due to rescheduling, and do you see these other industries like tobacco, pharma, alcohol coming in and consolidating a lot of the market?
Yeah, it's tough to say, right? I mean, it all depends on what the market reaction is. I mean, we're trading at a much lower valuation than when we went public. Day one we closed at $28, and so if you actually look at what our market cap would be, it'd be approaching $10 billion, right? And you look at like a Molson Coors, I mean, that's a very comparable market cap. So again, at that level, are we getting too big to be acquired? Probably in certain instances, but big pharma is big pharma for a reason. And I can tell you, when there's estimates out there that legalization of cannabis is going to impact the pharma industry by $7 to $9 billion, pharma's paying close attention to this. I mean, AbbVie, they already have a synthetic version of cannabis called Marinol. It's grown in sesame seed oil, and of course, it's already a Schedule 3, fully approved FDA, and it's amazing what lobbying dollars can do for you. But so I think pharma's been sniffing around, but synthetic will never replace the actual plant being grown from a natural perspective. And I can't see pharma coming in and disrupting the industry in the sense of like the recreational component, because even like look at Germany, right? Like you need a prescription, you go into a pharmacy, like it works different in the US. And so, for pharma to come in and try to have the street cred that we do with the dispensaries and the clientele and really being able to grow the industry, I can see them trying to get in the space, but it's not as easy as I think they think it's going to be. And so there's always the chance for disruption, especially when think about this. How many industries are growing right now? There's not very many. Right. And so you look at cannabis, there's defined growth ahead as states come online, as, adult use gets recreationalized, as, revenue starts to, pick up in certain states. So I think it's going to attract interest. But it all really depends on what our market reaction is going to be and kind of where our valuations are going to be at. But I would say within the space, I would anticipate maybe some more consolidation, right? Because there are some single state operators and some other players that I think have been waiting for that lifeline. And so I think that's where it would start, and then it's kind of TBD on pharma, but they are sniffing around. I do know that. So,
yeah, you mentioned the lobbying dollars. I tell people all the time, like, just because alcohol, tobacco, pharma aren't directly involved in the industry doesn't mean that they haven't been spending a lot of money behind the scenes, waiting for the day when things change at a federal level, right?
Yeah. Well, you
You
look at there
mentioned,
was like the infographics. I can't remember. It was like 2 or 3 years ago about all the firms that put money against cannabis and the safe banking, and there were some very very large companies in there. Purdue Pharma was one of them. So I know that when you mention opiates, it's amazing that companies like that can stay in business. And I've
yeah,
had opiates even hit into my family, and I look at what a cannabis alternative could do, and it's amazing that the government still listens. But listen, you can't get frustrated, and I think people look at this space and say, oh my god, it's doom and gloom, and we're waiting for the DEA stamp of approval. But in reality, think about where we were at 6 years ago until we were at now. I mean, like 6 years ago, people didn't even know what the acronym SAFE stood for, and now literally the highest level of the government is looking to reclassify us to Schedule 3, and then safer banking could potentially come in. States, we didn't even touch on this. I mean, certain states are decoupling 280E, and so states are taking control of programs. And so there's been a lot of momentum and movement in the right direction. But you're fighting this behemoth industry and pharma and other industries that are going to be impacted by us. This isn't going to be a hand-holding moment. And so, when pharma, what was it? I think I saw a statistic, and you're a legal guy, so correct me if I'm wrong here. I think it was like $300+ million in lobbying dollars last year alone as an industry, and I think cannabis had like 5 million. I mean, it's literally, it's David versus Goliath. But we're going to
yeah.
keep fighting a good fight, and if we can just get this stamp of approval, I think it gives us a little bit more leverage to really be able to push the narrative across the finish line.
Well, I love what you said about the research angle, and we've had guests on the podcast previously to talk about that. I mean, all of this has been done. All of this achievement, right? All of this growth has been done with limited to no research available.
Right.
So
We were throwing spaghetti against the wall like 2016, seeing which strains would do what. But I mean, when you start to think about like the intricacies of THC versus THCV versus CBN, CBG, like when you can start to mix and match these cannabinoids, and it could help with this indication or this, and we haven't really gone down that route yet. And so again, as I said, we're just really scratching the surface, and it's like you're going to go into a dispensary and say, hey, I'm having trouble sleeping, and they're going to say, okay, well, why don't you try this edible? But putting science behind that to really unlocking the power of what cannabis can do is really what excites me. And I think that's going to be kind of that next wave, that next evolution, because we're not just going to be growing and selling through dispensaries. I mean, there's a lot of adjacent industries that can benefit from cannabis. I mean, it's in cosmetics, it's in food, it could be in medicine, it could be in sleep aids. I mean, it's just there's a lot that you can look at from that perspective. So,
well, and I think it's interesting to compare and contrast to this burgeoning industry of psychedelics and psilocybin and ketamine, and those are I think if you were to poll Americans, much more would be considered to be much more the best way to say it, intense
yeah,
drugs, right?
yeah,
And like, you don't know many people that use ketamine casually, right? But my point is that there's been access to research,
yeah.
and it's gone through the approval process, and that's seems to be the next wave. But they've had the ability to actually do the research, produce studies, and there's much more governmental, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize this, the amount of governmental oversight that's already happened, and a lot of that is backed by big pharma, right?
It is.
So I'm
Well,
curious
think
your
about
take
this,
on
Jim. I
that.
mean, when you look at the psychedelic realm, and people do think it's a very intense form of medicine, but like people will go and do a surgery and be administered fentanyl and not even think twice about it, right? And so, how many
Yep.
people use fentanyl casually? There's probably not
Yep.
a lot that I mean, there obviously it's a very widely abused drug, but it's a very strong and potent drug. But in a clinical setting, fentanyl can be used if you're going to go in for surgery and be used appropriately. So when you think about it, like LSD just got phase 3, approval. I think a company, MindMed, got phase 3. I mean, there's psilocybin, there's 5-MeO DMT. I mean, there's very strong psychedelics that are now very far down the clinical path. And I say
Right.
it because they're going down a different route. They're not saying come into a dispensary and we'll sell you a bag of mushrooms and just be careful. They can be strong. it's going to be in a clinical setting. And I mean, look what they're doing in Australia, right? And it's all through insurance. And this is kind of the irony of the situation. As you look at the path of cannabis, it's kind of like that rogue outlying industry where like we're just going to do this on our own. And you look at the psychedelic space and like we're going to play nice in the sandbox with the government, and we're going to go through the phase, clinical phase trials, and we're going to go through insurance, and we're going to do all this stuff. And so they're playing nice in the sandbox. And I'm not saying cannabis is going to do that, but there is an opportunity if medicines start to get developed off of this to go down that path. But I think that's what sets psychedelics and cannabis apart is really the routes to. I mean, a lot of these companies are listed on the NASDAQ. I mean, and they're like a tried and true biotech company that hasn't started making revenue yet. So,
right. Where do you see the opportunity for expansion for cannabis companies away from sort of the traditional products? And I'm thinking particularly like the hemp beverage space, which we've been doing a lot of work in and is also blowing up right now. Do you see the cannabis companies embracing that aspect of it a little bit more?
Yeah, I think you have to look at it, right? And early on, when you talk about operating in a gray area, that is the epitome of a gray area, right? Because you have Farm Bill passed, you have CBD, which is legal, and then you literally have this process to convert, to a THC like product. And does the government catch up and say, wait a minute, that's intoxicating, so now we're going to push back? Because I think the biggest thing, and I've spent a lot of time in DC, is really how uneducated a lot of these politicians are. And it's scary to think that you have people who are making decisions on behalf of the people that really don't know as much as they probably should when they're making a very educated decision on certain aspects. But it seems like the hemp derived beverages are going to be around. I mean, they're like, I just went to my local grocery store and there's a big display there, and Delta 9 beverage now is available for consumption. And so we're looking at everything. We've always looked at everything because we've had to, right? Like just, would its THC be, maybe a little bit safer just because of, some of the chemical process to get to the finished product? Maybe. But I can tell you all companies are really starting to do their homework on the hemp-derived beverages, because at first I think it was a novel idea. Now I think it's starting to take root here. And, because, another issue too, when you think about beverages, what we can only operate in each state that we operate, or only produce and sell in each state that we operate at, right? So we're 13 state operator. We can't do anything across, the state lines. Well, now there's this wiggle room. So you can start to get economies of scale. You can start to build a bigger distribution platform and a bigger manufacturing platform. So, and kind of take a model of like an Anheuser-Busch, right? But you would be using hemp-derived beverages there. So it definitely has our interest. And again, I think you're starting to look early stages at like, what can THC do in pain, balms, and what can THC do in, makeup and beverages and food. I mean, there's a lot of adjacent industries that are just sitting there waiting for this to be a legal product.
I'm interested in your take on Florida. So I know you guys are very active in Florida, and obviously it's a massive market. We're waiting for the Florida State Supreme Court to make a ruling on whether or not it's going to go to a vote of the Florida voters this fall. What is your take on which way Florida is going to lean?
Yeah, 6 months ago, absolutely not. And kind of go back to my earlier comment where you start to see people accepting. Nikki Haley talked about we're going to follow the science on cannabis and being used for medicinal benefits. And then now you have our buddy Ron DeSantis down there who has been kind of not anti-cannabis, but he hasn't been a pro-cannabis, although the largest medical program in the nation was built under his purview. But he's come out and talked about it, getting to adult use. And someone who knows every judge and every person in the state of Florida making that comment, you started to get a little bit more confidence on that. So the no comment yesterday, I know they're holding I think it's like, a special session on Monday to kind of get to the final opinion on whether or not it's going to reach adult use. Things are definitely moving in the right direction. And so a state like Florida, who has 120 million visitors a year, we have 2 massive cultivation facilities there. We have 74 dispensaries. I mean, we've just been priming the tank for an adult use transition. And to put it into perspective, we did $222 million in revenue alone in Florida as a medical program. And generally, when you see a market flip, you see a 2 to 3 times lift. So we saw about 2.5, 3 times in Maryland, which doesn't even remotely have close as the tourist population as of Florida. So it's not out of the realm to think that Florida could be $1 billion market for us if we really got up and running. And so I think that overall, I think things are moving in the right direction. Now the challenge is going to be, the ballot, right? Because it's not 50%, it's 60. And so, we just really united with a lot of the other larger operators in the state of Florida to have a campaign where it's literally going like door to door and knocking and making sure that people understand, the power of the cannabis plant and really what a yes vote could mean in the fall. And so we're really uniting as an industry, which is encouraging because, a lot of times it's, you want to make more money than the next person, but, this is about the betterment of the people and really giving them more access to this medicine.
Yeah. And it goes back to your earlier point of the need for education, right? Whether it's voters or elected politicians, there's just, we're still dealing. I mean, it seems like we've been in this for a long time, but, cannabis is still a relatively nascent industry, and we're still dealing with the stigmas and trying to educate folks on the product itself.
Well, and you think about this, we met with, and I'll leave names out, but, very predominant senator out of New Jersey who has been a pro cannabis type of individual. And he was very much like, a lot of times this isn't necessarily a Democrat versus Republican thing. It's an age thing. Right. And so you think, the way that a lot of these people grew up, it was the war on drugs. And we have all seen the fried egg in the frying pan. And if you haven't, then you're part of the new wave that's like, why isn't cannabis legal? But, we all thought cannabis would lead to heroin. It would lead to crack. It would lead to, and then you start to look at how stupid that is. And you start to think, though, that there's politicians who are in their 70s who are like, this is a gateway drug and we need to protect the constituents because that's what I'm, in office to do. And so I think when you start to get like a younger wave in, I think it would be more accepted at the federal level. But, again, I know it is Republican versus Democrat a lot of times, but I do think there's a major age component to this as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always wanted to get one of those T-shirts from The Onion that says, "Drugs win the war on drugs."
If you get one, buy me one. I'm a large.
I will. Well, we are out of time. Aaron, I just want to thank you again for joining us on Above the Haze. It's been really informative, and we appreciate you lending your expertise.
No, I appreciate you having me on and kind of a final blurb. I mean, this is a really exciting time, and I know we get frustrated, but tell me how many startup industries have accomplished as much as cannabis has accomplished in such a short time period. I saw this graphic the other day where it really started to show startup companies and when they really start to realize value in the public markets. And like Netflix was like 15 years out. So I think we're impatient. And I think we all thought this was the Willy Wonka golden ticket early, but right now we're building a real industry and we're really starting to get the support at the federal level. So I think this is a really exciting time right now. So
absolutely. Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Thanks, Jen.